welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 2, your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion. Well, we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. I was going to do a Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead segment. I thought that was a little too heavy-handed. The infamous, as every Tennessee Volunteer fan would call him, yet most people would refer to him as the famous, the unique, the one-of-a-kind, Nick Saban is retiring as head football coach of the University of Alabama. And reflections on Fargo Season 5, Episode 9. Thank you to all of my loyal listeners. I do appreciate your attention. Please like, subscribe, 5-star, write a review if you're new to the podcast. You could support This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast on Patreon. Links in the description. Let's make our way.
Act 1, Sayonara Nick Saban.
A major name, a major domino has fallen in the college football ranks, and it's not the one that I thought I'd be talking about when I was doing this segment. I figured that Jim Harbaugh, coming off of his national championship at Michigan, would be entertaining a number of NFL coaching jobs, and given that both New England and Seattle are now open, there's a lot of opportunity for him. Having had such success in the NFL prior to taking the Michigan job, I think Harbaugh is bound and determined to be an NFL head coach and to win a Super Bowl. And yet here I am with the segment on one Nick Saban. Strangely enough, Nick Saban has said sayonara to the University of Alabama and is retiring at age 72. And I say strangely because there had been rumors that Nick Saban was going to retire that had floated around. I didn't talk about them because I thought that they were asinine, and all of the people at Alabama, including Saban himself, refuted these rumors. Saban evidently went back to work the day after the loss to the University of Michigan, which to me, again, that's just an illustration of who Saban is, and that he was dedicated to the job, that he was going to come back and coach the Alabama Crimson Tide in the year of our Lord, 2024. Turns out he had other plans. As a Tennessee fan, I'm ecstatic that Saban is gone. Why? Because we couldn't beat him. I'm not going to sit here and gush about Nick Saban for 10 or 20 minutes. Our record against Nick Saban over the course of the time that he was head coach at the University of Alabama was 1-16. That's not a good record. The University of Tennessee's last nemesis, one Steve Spurrier, coach at Florida, went 7-3 against the Vols and was always willing to rub their face in it. Saban, for his part, never rubbed one's face in it, and he had the type of record that was staggering against a number of different teams, but against the rival Tennessee Volunteers, he never rubbed us as fans, he never rubbed our noses in it. It was the simple weight of all of the victories that made you hate the man so much. There's a lot of speculation out there on the internets, on the social medias about who's going to be the next Alabama head coach. And as abrupt as the announcement was that Saban was retiring, Alabama has asserted that they're going to have another head coach in place in 72 hours. So given the date of this publication on Saturday, the 13th, it could have already taken place. That hiring could have already taken place, although I think it's not going to be announced until Sunday or very possibly Monday, the new hire. Frankly, I don't care who it is. They're not going to be able to amass the type of record that Nick Saban did. There's only one Nick Saban. And there may be a Jimmy Johnson, Barry Switzer type situation that goes on at Alabama where the next couple of years, Alabama is still that powerhouse. But without Nick Saban, Alabama isn't going to be the same destination, the same recruiting destination, the same NFL factory that it was. The SEC West is now wide open. The SEC itself is more wide open, even though Georgia is still a juggernaut. And college football has a different landscape with the retirement of Nick Saban. The impact, the reverberation in the near term is going to be massive. When head coaches leave a program, every single scholarship athlete can leave that program within 30 days. you are going to see massive turnover of college football rosters, both people leaving the University of Alabama and people coming to the University of Alabama. And that's going to cause a ripple effect all over college football, not only with coaches, because you're going to see a coach leave a premier college football program to take the Alabama job. Then you're going to see other marquee candidates take that job. Let's just say that it's the University of Texas. Let's say that Alabama ends up hiring Steve Sarkisian. And I'm not saying that he's going to go, he's going to take the job. Let's just use it as an example. Let's also assume that Jim Harbaugh is going to take one of those NFL openings. So he's going to leave, and the University of Michigan is going to be looking for a head coach. You're going to see some of the biggest names in college football and maybe even pro football entertain taking those positions. If a college football coach ends up taking the Alabama job, ends up taking the Michigan job, then you've got another marquee, another premier position open in another college, and then you see all of these dominoes start to fall. You see that reverberation, that ripple effect throughout college football. Now, given the change in the rules, you're going to see turmoil, complete turnover in the roster on these different teams, because these athletes are going to have the opportunity. And I said scholarship earlier. I believe it's anyone who's on the team. They're going to have 30 days to transfer to another school and no impact. They can transfer anywhere they want. They have immediate eligibility. They're going to be able to transfer to a different school. So right now, one of the most talent-laden rosters in college football is open to pillage. I'm sure there are a number of recruiters from other college football teams that are headed to Tuscaloosa right now, literally en route right now to recruit those players. Sayonara, Nick Saban. I won't shed a tear watching you go. I will enjoy the earthquake that you have created on the landscape of college football, that earthquake being singular to the mass, to the gravity that was the man, Nick Saban, that was the legend, Nick Saban.
Act 2 Reflections on Fargo Season 5, Episode 9.
As uneven as I found Episode 8, I found Episode 9 to be rock solid, to be very, very concise in the way it's wrapping up some of its storylines. And I love the way that the character arc of both Ule and Gator have developed. I also like the character arc of our Indira character. I love the character arc, the juxtaposition between Lorraine, Lion, and Dot. And as I will get into, I'm very interested now in what we will call the fissure between Roy Tillman and his father-in-law. The episode opens on a very remote, a very serene, if that's the right word, but because of the way the music comes in, a foreboding, a sense of isolation surrounding this ice fishing shack. And here we have Ule with a tied up gator. We don't know how they got there, but we know that Ule was in the back of the squad car. So he has his ways, he has his means. He has kidnapped Gator, and he has him in what now we understand to be what very likely was Ule's domicile prior to co-opting that elderly woman's house. As part of Ule's character arc, as you recall, and as I've mentioned numerous times in the podcast segments, this is a self-proclaimed nihilist, yet when it comes to balancing the scales of justice, there is a sense of right and wrong when it comes to making a promise, fulfilling that promise, and then having the consideration as part of that promise be tendered. Within the structure of that deal, in Ule's mind at least, as it's been portrayed throughout the course of the series, and particularly in this episode, episode 9, it isn't so much that he has the consideration or that the consideration is tendered. It's that it's given freely, that once a promise is made and the promise has been fulfilled, the consideration is given freely. There is no threat that there's going to be a negotiation, an argument, a threat that the consideration isn't going to be tendered. And because of that somewhat childlike worldview, Ule had no reservation about leaving a bag full of money in the back of his car such that Gator could take it back. Now, that's one interpretation. It's the one that really came through me as I was watching the television program and I was reflecting on what I was going to say for this podcast episode. Yet, there is a flip side to Gator's motivation and to Ule's motivation based on what I believe he understands about Gator, about who Gator is. And that's that there is this resistance to the promise being fulfilled, and the consideration, because the promise wasn't technically fulfilled. Gator hires Ule to kidnap Dot, or as she's known, Nadine, to Gator and his father. He doesn't accomplish the goal, so he's not going to get the money. In Ule's mind, he wasn't given all of the information necessary to complete the job, to fulfill the promise, so he's owed the money anyway. In that context, it's very possible that Ule left the money in the car thinking Gator is going to come back. He's going to try to make things right in his own mind, even though his father has paid up, so to speak, has reconciled this ledger. I'm going to leave the money in the car to tempt him to do something stupid because there is this unpaid debt between Ule and Gator. And in a nihilist's worldview, in my mind, if the only thing that the nihilist was concerned about was money, once that money was tendered, then the nihilist would be gone. Then the whole scenario would be concluded and it would be over with. And yet it's not. And I believe that this is part of the redemption story of Ule, one that I mentioned earlier on in the season. I believe it was in the second or third episode. There may be a redemption story for Ule, and that redemption story has something to do with Dot, and it turns out that that's the case. And what is that redemption story? It's that, yes, Dot is the tiger that's been caged. I don't believe that's the catalyst for the redemption. The catalyst for the redemption, curiously, was the accidental killing of the woman whose house Ule was staying in, and the fact that he felt some sort of affinity for her, although it's not really well expressed because Ule is a man of few words, he felt an affinity for her based on the relationship that he had with her and the relationship that she had with her son. The fact that he was aware that she had a son that was a complete and total disappointment to her and was also leeching off of her. Does that strike you, dear listener, as having a parallel between the relationship that Gator has with his father, Roy Tillman, Gator being a constant disappointment? Does that strike you, dear listener, as having a parallel in the relationship between Lorraine Lyon and her son, Wayne Lyon, a man who Lorraine sees as a boy and completely incompetent and incapable of following in her footsteps? Ule certainly doesn't see Gator as a man, as an equal. He sees him as he is, that scared child that's in an adult body that is capable of such great violence. And within the emotional paradigm of anger and jealousy and envy and deceit. Recall, Ule's origin story is that of a sin eater, of someone who was compensated, who was paid to take on, in absolution of the sins of another, take on these sins of anger and of violence, of rage, of jealousy, of envy, of deceit. In a break from his own self-proclaimed nihilism, I don't believe that he can allow for someone to not only express all of those sins in their life, he can't accept that they will also, in any way, shape, or form, gain from them or have any kind of absolution from them. So, although we don't see it, Ule cuts out Gator's eyes, and we don't know quite how that storyline is going to develop, at least not at that point in the episode. We move then to the windmill, which again is now part of the landscape, that kind of Kafkaesque landscape that things are centered around this windmill on the Tillman property. There's the dialogue between the ranch foreman and Tillman with regard to Dot, and we as viewers get that first kernel of vulnerability about Roy Tillman in his own language, in his own words. He loved Dot. He's had 3 wives. It's clear he didn't care for the first one, and he didn't really care for the third one. We've seen as much in the way that he treats her. Somehow he develops different feelings for Dot, and in that dialogue you can tell that he loved her, because love requires one to become vulnerable. There is no true love without vulnerability. And in the dialogue between the two characters, Tillman expresses his steadfast desire to never go back to that place. Now, there's vulnerability in relationships with a lot of different type of people. But when it comes to the vulnerability that a man expresses with a woman in love, it's clear that this was the most vulnerable that Tillman had ever been in his entire life, even in the relationship that he has with his son, Gator, and with his two daughters. There is no vulnerability. He let himself be as vulnerable as he was going to be in his relationship with Dot, and in his mind, she repaid him by burning him, by running away. Dot, for her part, says over and over again that Roy is a coward, and in a move that I believe reflects as much, instead of Roy dispatching Dot himself, he has the ranch foreman go do it. I don't know if you noticed as much, dear listener. I thought it strange that in that moment of vulnerability, when he was going back to the place that he had forsaken, he couldn't bring himself to face Dot again, even though most of the trouble that he was now facing was a product of the fact that he couldn't let Dot go when he found out that she was still alive and was in the neighboring state of Minnesota. As we know, Dot escapes, as we figured she would, and that begins a cat and mouse game of Dot circling around a ranch that she's very familiar with, encountering the current wife, which I thought was interesting in that the current wife was at one point tempted, recognizing Dot as somewhat of an equal in that they had both endured the same hardships, and yet not being able to bring herself to break free from those shackles as Dot did. Of course, you knew it was a problem that Dot had gotten that close to her and was able to quickly dispatch her. Put an asterisk next to that because it comes back later on in the episode. I quite enjoyed the conversation that Lorraine Lyon has with Indira, leading to the quip about the orange idiot and getting him involved so that the FBI would then descend onto the ranch. And it took me a second to register that this show does in fact take place in 2019. That orange idiot, if that was the president of the United States, would have been Trump. And I believe that it's in character with who Lorraine is as a business person that she would be a Republican supporter and therefore a Trump supporter, and like many business moguls would refer to Trump as the orange idiot. So we have both the FBI mobilizing and we have what you would call the militiamen, the patriots, as Roy Tillman refers to them on the television program, mobilizing, coming to the ranch. And interestingly enough, there is the specter that not only the militia that he's been supplying with county money, with county equipment, that independents, people who support Roy Tillman and support his laissez-faire economic disposition, his attitudes towards the federal government, that they may be mobilizing as well and en route to the ranch. Tillman threatens as much when we get the cartoon character FBI and SWAT agents presenting to the ranch. You've got a fight inside the ranch, and you very likely might be surrounded, having a fight outside of the ranch, a fight just to get off of this property. I did find in the montage of the militiamen coming to the ranch, the choice of YMCA to be a curious one in the music for the montage. And given how intentional Noah Hawley is with the music that he chooses, it trivialized in my mind the rallying of the troops, so to speak, at the Tillman Ranch, these militiamen. It made the foundation of their belief system to come off as buffoonish. I don't know if any of you noticed that, dear listeners, but it struck me that with all the different music to choose from, particularly music that could have been more militant, that could have been more aggressive, that he chose YMCA. Other highlights, and I alluded to it earlier in the segment, I had questioned whether or not Ule had left the money in the duffel bag in his car when Gator shot the cadaver of the woman's son, and then in the scuffle knocks her down, kills her, and then he realizes that he's got to get out of Dodge. It turns out the bag did have all the money still in it. It turns out that Gator had stuffed that away in his closet, didn't tell his father, and in the cat and mouse game where Roy is looking for Dot in his own home, he finds that money and realizes that Gator had done something that was far outside the scope of what his father asked him to do, and that had brought about the ominous feeling surrounding why Gator had been missing, at least as we understand it in the universe of the story. Now Roy has some idea as to why Gator had been missing. He probably immediately, although it's not expressed in words, suspects that Ule's involved because Gator had gone out and gotten the money back. And then we have Ule's redemption story. First, presenting Gator to his father in this feeble condition and letting his father know that you give with one hand and you take back with the other. The hand that you take back with gets chopped off. And intent is irrelevant. In other words, it doesn't matter whether or not Roy knew that Gator was going to go out and do what he did. The fact that it was done brings about the consequences. Ule has an absolutist's worldview, that the action was undertaken brings about the consequence, and the feelings or the emotions or the intent underlying it aren't really part of the consideration. This is a worldview held, represented by Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. Again, you see Ule use Gator as, for all intents and purposes, a bullet shield and walk him closer to Roy Tillman, whereby he's able to throw him at Roy Tillman and then disappear into the fog. Gator, as far as his character is concerned, has been broken down into the child that he always was, into that scared child that was using this bravado, that was using this hubris as a mask for the fact that he felt his father's disappointment in him and that he was never able to live up to what his father wanted him to be and that he was never that winner. You see him broken down into that vulnerability himself. And I noted the juxtaposition between these two characters. You have Gator's vulnerability being that he doesn't feel adequate in his father's eyes, and he doesn't ever want to go to that place. You have Roy's vulnerability over a woman that he fell in love with and that, again, in his own mind, scorned him. And he says, I don't ever want to go back to that place. And then you have the presentation of this son who's been a disappointment to him after he has already declared, I'm not going back to that vulnerable place ever again. And he utters one of the coldest lines in the history of television. If there was ever a point to you, it's gone now, as his son cries out to his father. Ule, for his part, finds out where Dot is hiding, as he has this sixth sense, always knows where to be and when to be there, dispatches the ranch foreman and his two acolytes and frees Dot to go about her business, stating the tiger has now been freed. Ule may be out of the picture altogether now. That may be Ule's character arc in its fulfillment. He has righted what he believes to be a wrong. He has taken on the sins of Roy Tillman, of Gator Tillman, and instead of accepting those and accepting the money for those, instead of being that sin eater that continues on in this immortal yet soulless existence, he rejects as much. And that's what I wrote down, that perhaps the reason why the money was in the bag in his car, it wasn't that, perhaps it was because he really didn't care about the money and it was more about getting the benefit of the bargain. Perhaps it was a lure for Gator. I believe now, at the end of episode 9, that Ule has rejected this role, this demeaning, this subjugated role of soul eater. Sin eater. He's rejected the money. He's rejected the opportunity to take on the sins of another, again, namely Roy Tillman and his son Gator, and he has freed himself and Dot of this sinful obligation. So in the final episode, we may not see anything of Ule anymore, although Gator is still alive, and so is Roy, and so there may be some final retribution between those characters. Having said that, it's very likely there's going to be a final confrontation between Dot and Roy. So again, we may have seen the last of Ule, one of the finer characters to have been written into a season of Fargo in all 5 seasons. And how should such a fine character ride out of such a television program? What is the best way to usher in and then usher out such a fine character? That white stallion that he rides out on? Whipping Post by the Allman Brothers. Great song. Absolutely great song. Is there some deeper, a subtle meaning to using that song as Ule walks out of the scene? Perhaps. Perhaps he had been tied to that whipping post of having been the sin eater, someone that was willing to take on the sins of another for money, and now he's been freed of it. Perhaps there is no deeper meaning. It's just a kick-ass song. Do I have plenty more notes? Yes, I do. Are there many more things that I could talk about? Yes, there are. I'm not going to go into all of that because, of course, I like to try to keep these segments as short as possible to give myself as much opportunity to edit, to not bog myself down in the editing process. The last thing that I do want to note, and I think that this is going to be important in the last episode of the program, is this discord between Roy Tillman and his father-in-law. His father-in-law boldly telling the truth of the entire season that Roy was willing to risk everything. His seat as sheriff, his relationship with his father-in-law, that relationship being of supplying this modern-day militia, this Patriots Army, of his relationship with his wife, of his relationship with his 2 daughters, that he was willing to throw all of that away just to have his moment of retribution with Dot. And that instead of being that bold man, that pioneering man, that leading man, the father-in-law is confronted with the fact that here's a guy who's basically, I believe as the father-in-law put it, burrowing himself in a hole. The Tillman character makes some fiery speeches about that this has always been his path, and he always knew it was going to come to this. I'm not sure the father-in-law sees it the same way, that going out in a blaze of glory on the Tillman Ranch is how he envisioned his military, right? This pseudo-militia that he's built, that he saw all of these guys just getting shot up on the Tillman Ranch. I think he had visions of grandeur storming the state capitol, something to that effect. And here he is going to expend all of his treasure, including very likely his own life, his daughter's life, over whether or not the FBI can come in and search the property for Dot? Ooh, I see dissension in the ranks, dear listener. This very well may turn into a Mexican standoff where you have the Tillman faithful, the ranch hands, you have the militiamen, and then you have the FBI and the state police. It wasn't lost on me that Whit Farr, the North Dakota state trooper that took a bullet in the leg from Ule, had to tell what we'll call the rescue team, don't shoot the hostage. As he rightly suspected, Dot does have a weapon and is roaming the property, and who knows how that's all going to play out. I'm excited for this last episode, as I am sure you are, dear listener. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.